There's a crazy semicircle in front of your camera.
That's my ring light. It got lowered by cat invading the blanket.
I have dog invading podcast space. Chewy, chill out.
I bet these pets have been bought off by Renew Economy. They are saboteurs.
Could be.
Does Renew Economy have a beef with us?
Oh, because we're gunning for their #1 climate podcast spot.
Yep.
Are we? Okay.
Oh, didn't you realise that, Frankie? That's what this has all been leading up to. But if you strike at the king, you must kill him.
Giles, I'm not a part of this.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. Isn't it nice to be looking forward to some holidays? And I'm here in Gadigal land.
It's lovely to be looking forward to some holidays and a holiday special of Let Me Sum Up. It will get to that later. And it's my great delight to introduce a man who on a recent edition of RN Drive was introduced as the Energy Efficiency Council's CEO, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant, and congratulations.
Well, look, RN Drive and I were going to tell you before it was announced. But look, there's been some changes, Luke. And I think in time you'll grow to understand why RN Drive made the decision that they did.
Well, yes, I'm delighted to serve under the new Reid regime, and looking forward to you watching the fort over my summer break, Tennant.
Damn! Zoons! RN Drive has boxed me in again.
On this week's show, we discuss a big new report launched at COP27 that looks at the actions we need to take to improve the integrity of net zero commitments, particularly those made by businesses. But first, among the many corners we've managed to create in this founding year of Let Me Sum Up, one sturdy perennial has emerged. Tennant, this last week asks, nay, demands that we convene one last energy crisis corner for 2022. What exactly happened in Canberra last week?
Well, it was Energy Solutions Corner in Canberra last week.
I like that. You took it and turned it.
Well, partial solutions. So the things moved very fast. Like after a long period of publicly things not moving at all, the hintings that the government started to give, well, more than hintings, once the budget came out, and the budget in October said, holy hell, electricity prices are going to go up 56% over 2 years and gas prices nearly as much, and heavily hinted that the government would do something about this. Expectations began to grow. The futures prices for wholesale electricity in the national electricity market began to fall with the expectation that something would be done. And not so very long ago, the government reached agreement with the states that they would collectively act or do different bits of the puzzle together to cap gas prices and to cap coal prices temporarily, and to introduce a mandatory gas code of conduct that would keep a lid on prices and keep them from being influenced by export prices for some further period. They then moved to legislate that, and they brought Parliament back for one day, a special command performance to get together and pass this bill. Various people complained about the process, which is pretty ritual for these things. Government's suddenly decided the pieces are falling into place for it to do something. Indeed, this was not your classic, let's have 6 months of consultation and an issues paper and an exposure draft for a long period. I think that there was 24 hours for stakeholders with the exposure draft of the legislation. So, procedurally, not beyond reproach. But the legislation did pass, and the price of the legislation passing was the government agreeing with the Greens that they would make a significant push on energy efficiency and electrification, particularly for homes, in the coming budget. I don't think a dollar figure was formally announced, but a substantial push is the impression that everybody's got. And, in the annals of deals that are done on the sidelines to ram legislation through the parliament, that was probably one of the most sensible deals that's ever been done. There might have been an element of, oh no, don't throw me in the briar patch, to the government being held over a barrel and forced to agree to do a big push on energy efficiency and electrification.
Well, as we know, this is all an area that the government was focused in pretty intensely on anyway. Yes. Through the National Energy Performance Strategy. That consultation is out and about. So in some ways, not surprising that they were open.
Yes.
To that suggestion from the crossbench. I know this is something you were pretty excited about, Frankie.
It's just really nice to see a progressive parliament working together in a way that results in really sensible commitments that are, pretty widely welcomed. I think you're right. There's not a dollar figure attached to it, but I guess to secure support from the Greens, I think David Pocock was the other significant person there as well. It ought to be substantial, and I think what they've said they'll do is announce that figure in the lead up to the budget, which is around the timing of when they're expecting to finalise that National Energy Performance Strategy. Yes. But there are lots of groups out there advocating a focus on electrification, and I think my one more thing last time we chatted was a push on electrification for the built environment, including homes. So there is a really significant groundswell of industry proponents supporting a shift to electrification, and I think of course the government will be hearing that as well as other parties like the Greens and independents like Pocock. So it's great, bring it on. Can we have that race where they just continue to pitch more and more money at this? because the task is huge.
It is huge, and what they've announced is pretty focused, right? So they're focused on vulnerable households and SMEs, and it seems to be largely the lens they're looking at this through is electrification. But in the government's official statement, they do sort of reference, well, this could also address other technologies, which might look at other broader sort of energy efficiency measures that would be beneficial for that cohort. I'm thinking thermal performance could play a significant...
Would make sense.
Yeah, make a lot of sense. But then, when you go, well, what's next? There's actually a huge amount to be done in a bunch of other sectors of the economy. And thinking about that in an integrated way, how you support those vulnerable households in a way that builds up an ecosystem that then benefits other parts of residential housing, doing that in an integrated way would be super important, right?
It's questionable whether you'd say we're in a fortunate position to be watching what other countries around the world have done, because Australia is really far behind when it comes to the performance of existing homes, and including energy efficiency and electrification retrofits.
We're more than far behind. It's closer to being like in the grandstands at the Grand Prix.
Yeah.
Stroking our goatees and thinking about investing in a Formula One initiative.
But so I think, though, Luke, what you're talking about is the need to build up an ecosystem. That's the enormous challenge before us, right? You and I were in Germany earlier this year. This is a country that's thrown $20 billion a year, in programs on, building homes to higher standards, and they're saying they don't have the amount of skills in the workforce to electrify their building stock in the timeframes they've committed to. So it is really a significant endeavour, and I think, as with the way other countries have done this, they do appropriately seek to prioritise low-income and vulnerable households as priority, and that sort of helps start to build up that ecosystem. But, you'd want these sorts of interventions to be rolled out across the economy. This is just the proving ground for that.
Now, you might say, what was the point of all this efficiency electrification stuff? I thought energy prices were solved now. It's been decreed that they're going to be cheap.
Who's saying that?
Well,
our hypothetical listener. All our listeners are much smarter than that, Tennant.
Yes. Well, it's worth noting that energy prices won't be really cheap because most electricity and gas, certainly for industrial customers, but also for retailers who will be selling on to household customers, most of it for 2023 has been bought ahead. And so the introduction of these caps at the very end of this year, it will moderate what were otherwise going to be trenchantly enormous energy price increases into only eye-watering ones. And while there will be a further impact, we'll see what happens in the coal markets. I wouldn't be surprised if there is a discussion about extending the coal price cap for a further year. On gas, this mandatory gas code of conduct with a reasonable price element is going to be fraught. It's going to be complex to do. It's going to be messy, but I think it is going to have a price suppressing effect for several years. That won't last forever. The government has signalled, the Treasury has signalled that when the crisis in Ukraine is no longer creating action stations emergency in global gas markets, that those elements won't be needed any longer. And so whether it's because prices won't be that low in the near term or because they'll be back to being exposed and volatile in the longer term, it's still going to make sense on a cost basis, if as well as all the other reasons, to do gas substitution and efficiency and energy efficiency more broadly.
So all sounds eminently sensible, but what about some of the critiques that have been made in a very considered and I think, muted sort of way in the Australian media? Measured has been the way I described the debate over the last week, Tennant and Frankie.
You certainly should say measured. Or our commissar overlords from Venezuela will shoot you in the back of the head.
Gas industry not super thrilled by this package of measures.
And apparently taken by surprise.
They say that. But certainly, as you say, since the October budget, it was pretty clear there was something going to be in this broad space, right? And there seems to be a distinction being made between the price caps, which they characterise as something that they're not particularly surprised about, and while they're not thrilled, less concerned about, and this ongoing mechanism around a reasonable offer price, which there's still a lot of detail to flesh out, right?
There certainly is. I hesitate to say that people are being not altogether straightforward, as Sir Humphrey might describe them, but I'm not 100% confident that the statements that the price caps are not the problem. The problem is something, reasonable price, future provision, something. I mean, the price caps are the thing. Like the reason for very great upset is that tens of billions of dollars were going to be made over the next few years from the invasion of Ukraine induced dislocation in global energy markets. The vast bulk of those dollars are going to be made from the export market, and that's still going to happen. But some of them were going to be made locally, and now fewer of them are. And some people miss the prospect of those dollars. And I think everything else just dresses that up more than it really needs.
Look, I would confess to not having followed the, socials of the various, groups representing that industry really closely. But it was all, pretty self-interested. as you'd expect at the end of the day, but there wasn't, a huge amount of what else are we doing to support, vulnerable households that are going to be, who already pay disproportionately higher amounts for their energy bills, like up to, sometimes it's 5 times more than the average household. And are going to be paying, I think the projections were, up to almost 50% more over the next couple of years for their energy. And now they're only going to be paying something like 36% more, but it's still really significant. I think, and actually it sort of goes to some of the points being made in the paper that we're talking about today. It's now, like I think people are starting to see through this. Like, these are also companies that have ostensibly net zero objectives, and what I think is coming into much sharper focus, certainly amongst close observers like us, but then I think even more broadly, is like, how can you say that but also be, kind of actively lobbying against what's in the best interests of consumers and a just transition and a few other things so I think this kind of behaviour is going to be coming under much more scrutiny than it ever has been before. Like, this is a really good example of that recently. I don't think anyone would be claiming that the gas industry's social licence to operate has come through this unscathed. And I do think it's interesting. I was listening to a podcast, Michelle Grattan's one. She interviewed Anthony Albanese and put to him, wouldn't a super profits tax have been a simpler way of dealing with the situation? And he sort of said, yes, it would have. But, and then what he didn't say was, the politics of that, I think, were really tricky for them, and certainly didn't want to be seen to be breaking election promises. And so they've sought to do, whatever the next best options are available to them that are going to deliver for households and businesses that are really going to struggle, even with these interventions over the next little while.
Yeah, the broad options were do something that cuts back volumes of exports of coal and gas, which would have been immensely controversial. And I would say in the current global energy crisis, a terrible idea. Or do some kind of export profits tax through the tax to reshape domestic prices, was some people's theory, or to provide revenue that could be thrown at households and businesses to offset the costs of the high prices, and taxing those export profits would have been super controversial too. Or cap prices, which is messy. It's not something that I thought we'd be talking about a year ago. 6 months ago, I did not think that was one of the options that the government would wind up going with. I thought they would go with some version of compensate people and find an export profits way to offset that cost. But none of these were options that were going to be uncontroversial. And the worst option of all was going to be don't do anything.
As an observer, I don't get super involved in supply side politics, but I'm obviously very interested in it. The argument that the gas industry seemed to be bringing to the table, which was leave us alone, just let us get on with it, just seemed entirely untenable. They seemed very good at shooting down any proposal that was put forward by, various individuals. And as you say, there's a menu of options out there, but there didn't seem to be a constructive agenda being put forward for how they were going to maintain their social licence by doing what ultimately was essential in this situation, which was supporting businesses and households that were relying on gas to get through the next couple of years. And it's just not tenable, and it seems self-defeating when, as you say, Tenet, the vast bulk of the profits that they stand to make over the next several years are actually in the export market. So maintaining that support from the Australian public would seem to be, in my view at least, in their best interests, even if it does mean a reduction in profits in the short term from the domestic market. And it's been done to them anyway.
Yes.
So it just doesn't seem like a very smart strategy. Now, far be it for me to advise, all the very well paid people who are out there sort of advocating on behalf of the gas industry on their political strategy in this space. That's not my job, but it was.
It could soon be a job for ChatGPT. Well, crisis partly ameliorated, job partly done, bit of headspace for people to focus on other stuff, like papers.
Like papers. Shall we chat about a report?
I am up for it.
Over the last several years, the cavalcade of voluntary net zero commitments from businesses and subnational governments have been hailed as a sign of gathering momentum towards a net zero economy. However, not all net zero commitments are equal, and critics argue that too many pledges lack critical elements such as robust implementation plans and serious near-term goals. These concerns prompted UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres to create the high-level expert group on net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities, which he charged with examining the integrity of net zero pledges and how that integrity could be improved. Last month, the expert group released its first report at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. The report is called Integrity Matters, Net Zero Commitments by Businesses, Financial Institutions, Cities and Regions. And Frankie, what did they find?
I mean, there's actually a fair bit to this, but I think a lot of it is familiar, and I think would be pretty familiar to some of our listeners. I found myself definitely thinking back through our back catalogue on our VCMI Net Zero Pledge episode, which is very relevant. And if you're a newish listener, hot tip, go back and listen to that one. Can't remember what episode it is. I think it's
Might have been episode 2.
Yeah, I think it was episode 2. Yep.
So this is a hot topic, right? This paper was launched around COP27, and in the plethora of other things released at COP, all of us clocked this one and said, "Oh, we'll definitely need to come back to this one."
And people called it the greenwashing paper.
The greenwashing paper, which I think we've all been referring to it as, and super timely even in an Australian context, given some work that Jim Chalmers announced for the finance industry, which I know we're going to talk about later because that's my one more thing, sneak preview. So the work of these experts, I think there's sort of 17 people that Gutierrez appointed, amongst them an Australian. Did you see Bill Hare on the panel, which is great, represent. And what they do is set out, I think there's 5 clear principles for entities to look at, and there are 10 recommendations. I think we can logically step through some of that. I thought it was interesting also that I think we all looked at this as definitely being targeted towards corporations, so companies that are making corporate pledges. But it's not just for those people, right? It's also for financial institutions and local and regional governments, noting that cities across the globe have actually been, really ambitious with their own climate pledges. I think noting that sometimes the complication with governance when you're dealing with sort of national governments and however many layers there might be between that and your cities, it was useful for having standards and sort of good approaches around credibility for these claims for those entities as well. So I thought it was interesting, especially noting some of the detail in what's gone through. I'm happy to talk through the principles, but I thought there were some real clangers that came through this that I think... so there's a lot of stuff in this that, as I sort of said at the outset, wouldn't be surprising to anyone here, especially if you're sort of across with the VCMI work that's been going on, and the other one that's a slightly longer acronym that's looking at the integrity of offsets themselves. But there are some really bold things here where it's sort of suggesting that, if you're making credible claims, you cannot claim to do that whilst continuing to build or invest in any new fossil fuel supply. And beyond that, any sort of investment or involvement in deforestation or other environmentally destructive activities also sort of disqualify you.
And not just directly, but in your supply chain.
In your value chain, yeah. So this isn't just your direct, scope 1 and 2 emissions. This is your scope 3 as well. So looking at upstream and downstream from your business. So that's extraordinary. And sort of very significant. There are a few other things here. I mean, the ones that I'm sure the three of us clocked in as well was also around, I think, really putting out there that if you as an entity are making a claim or a target towards net zero, and you're taking all the other steps around interim targets and things like that, you actually can't also lobby to undermine government climate policies that would contribute to policies that would create a level playing field and push, the rest of the economy onto a similar trajectory. So it talks specifically about trade associations and other bodies, so entities' involvement in lobbying. And then I thought maybe the most extraordinary one, I'm just sort of cherry picking a few things, but I think it would be also nice to talk through the principles. The other one was not only do entities need to, take the ambitious sort of voluntary action that they're committed to in these pledges, but they need to start now actively advocating for regulated requirements that would work towards net zero. So it sort of ties in with the advocacy through trade associations piece. But this is, if I'm setting out these steps to get to net zero and these are the policies needed, I am now obliged to advocate strongly in favour of these things for governments to regulate and create a level playing field. I thought those were really interesting things I hadn't seen stepped out so boldly before. And
that last one, that is a really important one. The context for all this is that the Paris Agreement obliges all parties to make commitments, and the commitments collectively add up to an outcome. And there has not been the equivalent for non-parties. So who are parties? Parties are nation states and European Union style supranational collaborations. So cities aren't obliged to do anything in particular. Provinces and states are not obliged. Companies are not obliged by that structure. But some of them have been going out and making commitments anyway, and they don't necessarily add up to anything in particular, and they're quite complicated to try and compare to national pledges. Like some of them are within national pledges and some of them aren't. And this report is saying, among other things, voluntary is great, but it can only take you so far. You need to level the playing field. Governments need to oblige companies and maybe cities and maybe regions, but I think they have particularly in mind companies to make net zero commitments and report and be judged by them. And yes, they're calling on companies to advocate for that, but they're calling on governments to just push past voluntarism and have some robust policies that require stuff to happen, which, if you do have mandatory frameworks, that does potentially make quite a few of the concerns that people have about voluntary commitments go away. Like that somebody's voluntary commitment could be made utterly meaningless by emissions popping up in another company or another part of the supply chain. There's many ways in which mandatory policies can go awry, but it is a relevant, if not entirely easy and straightforward to implement in every circumstance, recommendation.
So at a high level, I think this is a very ambitious report, which is trying to take almost like, it's funny to talk about these large corporate net zero commitments, but it's almost like a little bit grassrootsy, right? Like there's this enthusiasm, and that, it's partly driven by, individuals and boards and directors of goodwill that, want to do their bit. And it's also driven by investor pressure and the sense that they need to do this to kind of respond to the calls of their consumers. There's a lot of dynamics in there, but there is this sort of evolving ecosystem of net zero commitments, voluntary net zero commitments. There is a project here. And I think it's underlying, and I don't make it completely explicit, but it's definitely there to transition that sort of nascent ecosystem to something which is universal, which is standardised, which is rigorous and robust, and is kind of taking this kind of nascent ecosystem and just making this par for the course. Everybody's got transition plans. Everybody's got net zero commitments. Everybody is decarbonising at the rate that is appropriate for their sector, and that's just a thing that's happening. So it's trying to work with the momentum that has been established over the last several years, and jiu-jitsu flip it into like a worldwide standardised system of decarbonisation across sectors. It's incredibly ambitious in that sense. And while it's a very short report, and while I agree with you, Frankie, there is a lot there which is it's a little bit motherhoody when you're reading it through it and you're familiar with this space and seeing some principles level stuff that we've all read, probably 100 times before. But there's other things which are new and quite radical ideas, and it seems like what they're trying to create is like an integrated philosophical framework for how one would achieve that goal. That was my take by the end of it, because I've started the report a little bit bored and ended the report kind of interested and excited by what it was trying to achieve.
Like maybe some of the things that I think really contributes to the ambition that you're talking about here, and we've touched on a few things already, is really about what is the entity doing beyond covering its own patch. Like even to the extent of looking beyond your immediate value chain as well, which is no small feat, by the way. Like even being able to measure your scope 3 emissions across your value chain is almost impossible to do accurately in most sectors at the moment. So even that, very ambitious, and of course needs to be in the mix for all the reasons we talked about. If you're not taking account of that within your value chain, perhaps that slips through the cracks if you're not in a regulated environment where other smaller businesses are responsible for those emissions in their scope 1 and 2 and aren't going to do anything about it without a nudge. But what it also does is kind of frame what the entity's responsibility is, having made this commission, and really kind of claim to the credit for being able to say that we're targeting net zero and on a pathway to do it beyond their immediate patch. So it talks about how the fact that you need to be publishing a plan for how your work aligns with a just transition. Like what are you actually doing to support vulnerable communities? And it also really focuses in on small and medium businesses as well. The kinds of corporate bodies that, unlike at the large end where you might have, teams or at least people employed to focus on this day in, day out, there are a whole lot of businesses out there that just aren't resourced in that way and are going to need a lot of help to decarbonise their operations. So I thought that was really significant. It's the responsibility beyond just your, immediate kind of a patch of turf and your value chain emissions. It's about how you're creating that broader ecosystem of ambition. And I thought it was characterised really nicely. I saw this turn of phrase, ambition loop. Yep. And I think that you can apply that in a couple of ways. Like in one way, they're also acknowledging that there absolutely needs to be space given by governments for entities to do, really ambitious voluntary work, because they're going to experiment, with different interventions, and there'll be an experience that then, sort of feeds back, and that can inform public policy, which sort of then lifts everyone else, and so on and so forth. Like that's an ambition loop. But you also have to think that applies when we're also talking about that broader ecosystem that you mentioned, Luke.
So there is a lot in here. I think I'll highlight a couple of other things that I liked, but then I want to mention a couple of concerns that I've got. I think they make a really important set of points in the discussion about phasing out fossil fuels and scaling up renewable energy. There's a well-developed argument about just what a challenge it is to get the finance for developing countries in particular to do the scale up part. So there is a lot of focus in this about not investing in fossil anything. And they're talking very stringent timelines for this. That's to be compliant with these recommendations, your plan, whether you're a region or a company, has got to be consistent with shutting down coal generation by 2030 for OECD countries and by 2040 for others, and with no new exploration or expansion or slightly ambiguous wording production for coal and for oil and gas. That's very demanding. But renewables are super capital intensive. The cost is all in building them and financing them, barely anything in running them. And developing countries overall, like if we exclude China, have a significantly higher cost of capital typically than developed countries. So they will have both structurally higher energy costs as a result of that in a renewable energy world, and difficulty in getting renewable energy financed and built at a pace that is consistent with 1.5 degrees. So this report is calling on those making, like on developed countries, on multilateral finance organizations, the multilateral development banks, and on companies to play their parts in alleviating that. So anyway, I did think that accelerate the financing of the new things we need point is at least as important as the don't invest in the stuff that is incompatible with a 1.5 degree pathway. But what did you guys think of the offsets piece of this? Because it was very reminiscent of that previous VECME report in some ways, but also, well, it punted on some pretty big questions.
So it's super high level. My view is they're largely kind of dealing themselves out from saying a huge amount in this section. Yes. So what do they say? You need to prioritize emissions reduction in your value chain, i.e. you can't offset your way to net zero. Well, I think we're sort of clearly established that that's now fairly squarely considered greenwashing if that's the way that you're proposing to meet those objectives. So focus in on reducing emissions within the scopes that you can directly control first. And also, I think the VECME work also talked about not counting voluntary credits against interim emissions reduction targets on your way to net zero. So this is saying, you need to go about setting your trajectory in a credible way, aligning with IPCC report curves for, 1.5 with little or no overshoot, talks about science-based targets, that sort of thing. So go through that process, set interim targets. It also, I think, specifies that you need targets for 2025, 2030 and 2035. And so you're not allowed to use voluntary credits to meet emissions reductions at those interim stages. But what it does say is that beyond those emission reduction targets, it says, well, you can also use credits to support, mitigation activities for your emissions beyond that as you're going towards net zero.
And they have some encouragement in there for you for whatever your fair share of, given your circumstances, your fair share of emissions reductions, like within your supply chain is at a point in time, they encourage you to then offset everything above that.
Yeah.
Like all your remaining emissions.
Yeah, including like all your scope 3. So it's basically whatever else is in your value chain.
As long as they're additional and permanent reductions.
Yeah, but that's kind of all it says.
Yeah.
So again...
Solved.
Yeah, well, no, I'm just having the same gripe I had in episode 2, where I'm like... Tell us exactly... I think it's more the permanence one, really, now than additionality. I think there's a stronger, well-established thinking around additionality, but permanence is a whole other kettle of fish in a way, especially if we're talking about nature-based offsets and the longevity of those projects, versus what commitments are for entities that are wanting to use these credits. So they talk about high-quality credits which should fit criteria of additionality and permanence without really going into what that means.
Did we get to whatever your concern you're raising about this section, Tennant?
So like a couple of critical thoughts. So overall, I think the approach that they're setting out is a really, really demanding one, and it's so demanding that I don't know who's going to comply with it or participate in it. Certainly, it's easiest to comply with this if you're from an entity that's not particularly relevant to causing or curing climate change. If you're a financial body or a bank or something, there's some hard decisions in here around the emissions that you're financing. But it's a lot easier than if you are like a steel maker or you are a business that does electricity generation from fossil and renewable sources. And if you are like, I don't know, Shell or BP or something, like the only way you could possibly comply with these things is to say, we're not investing anything in our core business anymore. We're just going to run down that capital. And like many people might say, well, that's appropriate. Like they shouldn't do anything other than that. But it's quite exclusive. And I like the panel who did the consultations and the report. They're all eminent people, as far as I'm aware. I mean, Bill Hare, extremely eminent climate wonk and scientist, but it was about half finance people and about half assorted wonks and diplomats and pollies and activists, and there was one business person on there from a non-banking background, which was somebody who currently runs a coffee business and used to be a senior cosmetics executive. And like, I think that this would have benefited from some voices and some buy-in from heavy industry. Like people have got, controversial feelings about people from the fossil energy supply sector, but heavy industry is very important to this transition, and they're the ones where these arguments about like what's reasonable to say is a fair share for a supply chain or a subsector to do. That's where that argument is crunchiest. And it's a really important argument because, like, if you say, oh, well, actually, it's all a bit hard at a point in time for this subsector, then they could be just buying high-quality offsets for whatever else on top of that limited action, and a lot of the other arguments sort of just keep going rather than getting resolved. So I think this is a framework that's going to have a lot of weight. People are going to refer to this a lot because the UN Secretary General called it together and it's got a bunch of high-level people on it. But I don't know. I think it is going to be something that people from sectors that do have significant emissions today but could absolutely transition to and will need to have a strong part in a net zero future, I think they're going to have a hard time signing on.
I agree. Like, it's incredibly ambitious. But I wouldn't say the section on voluntary credits is. Like, I don't know that that's going a huge amount over and above what other frameworks like VECME have been saying about this. It's actually a fairly stripped back version of what some of those other frameworks are suggesting should be done.
I think that's right. Yeah. If somebody doesn't do this, would you say they are greenwashing? Like, is everything outside of this greenwash?
Outside of the overall report?
If you do something on emissions, but you're not doing this, are you greenwashing? I don't know. I assume some people are going to say absolutely yes.
I feel like at the heart of this, philosophically, is the transition plan stuff.
Yep.
And so we haven't talked much about the transition plans. There's sort of a few pieces of architecture in operationalising a net zero pledge. Obviously, you've got to have the pledge, and you've got to have a decarbonisation pathway as part of that pledge, which is articulated in a transition plan. The transition plan needs to have 5-yearly targets starting in 2025, and then you've got to be transparent about your progress against that, and that's the reporting bit. In the transition plan, what they say is, well, you need to explain your decarbonisation pathway, and the expectation is it is aligned with the decarbonisation pathway for your sector that is set out in documents of various luminaries have put out over the journey, and they reference the IEA and the IPCC. They're actually pretty, open about what your credible reference point is for your decarbonisation pathway towards net zero. And if your decarbonisation pathway is not that, then you've got to explain why. Why are you a special petal that isn't adhering to the sectoral decarbonisation pathway that is supposed to take into account some of the challenges that certain sectors of the economy have on that journey. Like, there isn't an expectation, I think, that, the steel sector is going to wave a magic wand and be decarbonised by, 2028 or something like that versus other parts of the economy where there are opportunities to decarbonise relatively quickly. I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to ask of companies that are putting out these pledges. And one of the things that I think is a good faith effort to address that there's going to be bumps along the way is to say, well, one of the reasons we want you to be transparent is that if you're not adhering to that trajectory, we collectively, civil society, governments, industry, want to know that sooner rather than later so we can help you sort it out. And that, just not having that transparency and that being sort of either hidden or not being properly measured, or just assuming that, she'll be right, mate, and waking up in 2032 and going, oh, shit, we're nowhere near where we need to be. That is a really bad outcome. And so to answer your question, and I think every dot point in this agenda is perfect and is immediately operationalisable? Probably not. But I think the heart of it, the intention of it, is probably right, which is that you need something very grounded in the science, and you need to, and if you are putting yourself out there and making a net zero commitment, then you should be held accountable to that. And that it is a good thing for all of us, given that we're broadly signing up to this collective effort, that is the case.
I also look at this as something that, it comes out and not everyone's going to be in a position to sign up to this tomorrow or say they comply with it. But I think as businesses and sectors globally across the world have gotten progressively a little bit more sophisticated in the way they think about these issues and their own transition plans, you do start to see a little bit of divergence in the way that people, think about this and their role and, the boundary of the commitments they should be making. So I do think it's important, like at this stage, this being the critical decade, that this serves as a bit of a statement of where the ambition needs to be. Not that there's an expectation that we're going to get there tomorrow, but that you can expect in the coming years that if you're revising your, net zero strategy in the next couple of years, you should start thinking about all these other things. Because agree with you. Like I couldn't think of a company that has ticked all these boxes that I've seen publish a net zero strategy. But perhaps that's the point, that we, need to start moving on some of these things. And, I think it features things that perhaps people wouldn't have expected to be elevated in such a way.
To bring it around to something we discussed earlier, if cities and regions and companies look at all this collectively quite demanding asks and say, oh, that looks like a lot of work and I'm just going to get criticised for falling short of it, I'd rather not, thank you. Well, that's where the push for mandatory regulation comes in. And their final recommendation just about is to have a follow-on task force, a task force on net zero regulation for the sharing of plans and by governments and the development of a more comprehensive approach to mandating a lot of this stuff, which in Australia we are going to be talking a bit more about.
Sharing notes, but also ensuring as far as possible consistency across jurisdictions, right?
Yeah.
So they name check the EU, the UK, Japan, China, South Africa, Kenya and India. The US is curious about regulation in this space. Certainly, as you say, Australia is intending to do something as well. There's every prospect for a lot of same but different systems emerging around the world, which is definitely not what you want, and so to the degree that you can start to support that collaboration across jurisdictions, so that companies that operate across them aren't sort of grappling with different regulatory regimes in different parts of the world. That's got to be a good thing. It's that theme of consistency is also one that's picked up in, I want to say, recommendation 8, increasing transparency and accountability. And this is one of the ones which I thought got really interesting, because it stopped kind of giving jobs to all the carbon intensive companies around the world and started giving jobs to the folk that are helping those carbon intensive companies sort of track and report their net zero pledges, which I thought was incredibly healthy. I was sort of saying, well, you've got net zero initiatives and alliances, you've all got slightly different systems, and your reporting requirements aren't very consistent, and you're not necessarily all holding your companies to account, requiring them to do independent verification, and you really should be kind of linking up with the UNFCCC's Global Climate Action Portal, all these sort of jobs which would make everybody's life a lot easier if they all got together and actually started raising their game, which I thought was healthy and is almost some pre-regulatory work that ecosystem can do to make it easier. If we all agree that at some point governments are wanting to be regulating some of this activity, the more consistency there is within that ecosystem, the easier it is for governments to act, right?
Yeah. And in the also in the category of giving jobs to service providers, there was an aspect of recommendation 6 on aligning lobbying and advocacy, where they were saying business services providers like advertising agencies, management consultancies, accounting firms, law firms should disclose how their customer engagement contributes to net zero. Not just, hey, we've removed the utterly insignificant emissions from the scope 1 and 2 operations of our advertising firm, but how is our core job and what we're doing with customers addressing net zero, which seems like both a good idea and also quite a tricky one in all kinds of ways to actually walk.
Well, you've sort of seen some of that come to the fore through very specific, instances of very public kind of events, right? Like where companies of the Adani coal mine's probably one that comes to mind. It wasn't just that company that was obviously subject to a lot of activism. It was also all the other companies servicing that one, engineering consultancies, all of that, I think were really put through the ringer in having to then engage with the questions they were being asked on your company purports to support strong climate action. How do you align these two things? How do you think about them? Even just asking the question, which I think, yeah, you're right, Tennant, like this is also sort of putting front and centre now.
I think what one can say about this paper is that it is an input into a framing device for a whole lot of processes that are underway as we speak. This space is very fecund. There's a lot of activity happening in the space of how one takes a voluntary commitment and then puts some structures, some frameworks, some clear expectations and some definitions of what good progress looks like. I'm interested to see whether this is the final word on what that looks like. I'd be kind of surprised if it was, but I think it will have a great moral force, and this report is very timely and will make them think twice about many of the issues that they're thinking about and the degree to which it's aligned with this intervention. All right, as always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
Very relevant to the conversation we've just had on greenwashing. And whilst, there were lots of news in climate land in Australia this past week, outside of Energy Crisis Corner, there were some really significant and I think anticipated announcements from the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, about what he's been doing in his patch to move on climate action in the finance sector. So he made a speech, I think, at ASFI, the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiatives event, and committed to an anticipated process, given there was money allocated in the budget for it in October, to kick off work on mandatory climate risk reporting for large entities. So those of you who are familiar with this space will be aware that there's a global body called IFRS. I think that's I always get it wrong, the International Financial Reporting Standards Board. Recently, within the last couple of years, created alongside its accounting standards board a sustainability standards board, with the intention of creating, and I feel like this one global thing to rule them all is becoming a bit of a feature of our conversations, but one set of sustainability standards which could be adopted by individual jurisdictions and then effectively mandated for listed entities or to comply with in their reporting requirements, where those are regulated by governments, which is what's done through IFRS for accounting standards. So they have an accounting standards board that's been doing that for some time. So IFRS kicked off their sustainability standards board, ISSB it's called. We love acronyms, and consulted on draft sets of their reporting frameworks throughout the year. There's more work on that to do. So Chalmers has kicked off a consultation here on, who must these requirements apply to and when? How would they interact with other financial reporting obligations? What body will provide long-term governance for these standards in Australia? So he acknowledges that there's, more work happening in the global space through ISSB on the final kind of shape and look of those standards, but they're sort of wanting to get a move on what the architecture around it will look like in Australia. So that's very exciting and was very warmly received by the finance sector here. Anyway, super significant and very exciting developments, and will have, I think, far-reaching impacts once these disclosure requirements start to kick in.
Right on point. The thing that stood out to me was going back to the conversation earlier about transition plans. They do feature in the paper, and very interesting in the context of some of the developments overseas. So the UK already requiring disclosure of large corporations aligned with TCFD. There is a stated intention, an announcement made at COP26 in Glasgow by Rishi Sunak when he's Chancellor, now Prime Minister, that they would be requiring the disclosure of transition plans on top of TCFD requirements. And so, interesting question for us as we seek that international alignment, as we watch what is happening in some comparable nations overseas, just how far we go in terms of some of that operational detail around how companies are acting on their net zero commitments.
It will be interesting to see how far beyond, because I mean the climate risk part of the work that ISSB is looking at, being the first cab off the rank in what could be a much broader ESG sort of framework that they develop, is grounded in TCFD. So like it makes sense that then it's well aligned. But yeah, how far individual jurisdictions choose to go beyond what the accepted kind of global standard is, will be fascinating.
Thanks, Frankie. Tennant, what have you got?
I have an early Christmas present courtesy of the European Commission, the European Parliament and the European Council of Ministers, because they have, as we record, just a few hours ago, finished taking a set of major decisions on European climate policy, including cementing agreement on the world's first carbon border adjustment mechanism. So we've been predicting for a long time. I've been banging on for a long time about how Europe was going to do this. They really, truly, actually are going to require imports to the European Union for key products: steel, iron, cement, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen is the latest addition, to pay a carbon price at the border equivalent to Europe's own domestic carbon price. They've also agreed to expand Europe's ETS to more sectors and to impose a second ETS on transport fuels and heating for buildings, fuels for buildings. And, you know, that's a huge topic. But the CBAM part is a very big deal. Now, they agreed a soft start for the CBAM. So there will be a handoff over time, free allocation to these sectors within Europe is going to gradually phase down, and the imposition of the carbon price at the border will phase up in line with that, so that there is no double protection for Europe and there is no double penalty for imports. And so in the first year of this, the reporting obligation is going to start allegedly next October 2023. There'll be a reporting obligation for 3 years, and then in 2026, financial obligation starts, so payments at the border. But in that year, the free allocation will only have been reduced by 2.5%. And so by 2034, all the free allocation will be gone, and there'll be a full liability at the border for imports. There'll be reviews in the meantime of how much further to expand this in terms of the products that it covers. It is going to include some indirect emissions, almost certainly just from electricity inputs to production. But it is going to be a gentle start for the first 5 years or so of this thing, and then it accelerates much further. So all up, I think, very exciting for trade and climate wonks. We're going to learn a lot from what the Europeans do. If anybody listening to this podcast is not already aware of a great big report on CBAMs and how they work and how Australian exports would be affected.
Sounds fascinating, Tennant. Who wrote that report?
It was me.
As it turns out.
Shameless self-promotion.
Well, look, the broad conclusion there was this was not something to be feared by Australia in the near term, and you can put 3 underlines on that after this agreement, but it is something that will be more and more relevant over the longer term, and particularly as a source of actually competitive advantage if our exporters of relevant products can decarbonise faster than average. They could gain competitiveness within the European market. So it's much more a carrot and a leveller than a stick waiting to whack people. But in any case, it's going to happen. Europe is resolved.
I was very interested to see that gentle phase-in. I thought it was longer than I anticipated. I don't follow this area anywhere near as closely as you do, Tennant, but it seemed like a long phase-in and a slow start. The thing that strikes me is that in terms of observing Europe and what a CBAM means, we're not going to really be able to tell very much about what a CBAM means because it won't be doing very much for the first few years, unfortunately. So it'll be interesting to watch almost the architecture that they need to put in place to manage it. I think that's where the early lessons will be. But as an interested but non-expert observer, it seems like maybe the real lessons of how it operates and how it affects activity in the market, if I can put it that way, maybe a few years off.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And look, the slow phase in is, we won't get completely in the weeds of it, but it is a substitute primarily for having an export adjustment. Like there was a big push from large parts of industry, and from the European Parliament to have a rebate of carbon costs for some exports, partial rebate, and that was resisted by the Commission and on the basis that they thought that it would be much harder to defend as WTO compatible. For what it's worth, I don't think they're right, but I am not the European Commission. You may be surprised to hear. Well, look, we'll see what Radio National has to say on the subject. But given that there wasn't that allocation for exports, adjustment for exports, a softer start was how they sought to make industry comfortable with it. And we'll see how comfortable they feel.
Could facilitate other jurisdictions thinking about looking into their own CBAMs to get onto it.
Why, yes, it could.
Oh, because that's the other implication of having like a bit of a long taxi, right? You sort of think, if we could get our collective stuff together and find ourselves not only not at a disadvantage, but able to impose our own kind of conditions on everyone else as well. Anyway, interesting.
I like your thinking, Frankie.
Luke, what's your one more thing?
So I'm going to take my turn in doing a non-climate one more thing. This is not just a climate podcast. We're a bunch of political nerds, and there's a lot of history to many of the words that get thrown around in political debate, which is why I've been enjoying a podcast called Origin Story that looks at the etymology and also, importantly, the cultural history of a whole bunch of hot-button words, most of which are political in nature. So some of the episodes that I've really enjoyed from the co-hosts Ian Dunt and Dorian Linsky have been on McCarthyism, neoliberalism, centrism, and a great episode on woke and the cultural history of woke. It's super fun. It's got, as I say, a bit of a political bent, but above all else, which is important for podcasts, they're great raconteurs. And I thought we did a lot of research for this podcast. These guys do a limited series, and they read multiple books before every episode. That often, seminal texts that kind of helped define the trajectory of these critical words. Many years ago, I felt much less put upon reading our 40-page paper this week after reflecting about the huge amount of work these two individuals put into their podcast episodes. So, summer listening, team, I highly recommend it. Origin Story.
Sounds good.
Noted with interest.
And speaking of summer listening, we have an announcement to make. I've not shared the outcomes of our holiday special survey. So listeners will recall that this is our second last episode of 2022. There will be a final episode, and instead of reading a climate report and talking about it, we're going to watch a climate movie and talk about it. After some debate last episode, we decided to stick with the poll as constituted.
As constituted nowhere in our non-existent governance.
Indeed. And as a result, it has closed. I can report results. I think I revealed somewhere, somehow, that the movie Day After Tomorrow never was doing very well, was never really in contention, and it has finished a distant third with 13.51% of the votes.
You're really dragging this out.
Soylent Green, Tennant's favourite, made a better showing, but finished in second place at 40.54% of the votes.
No.
And as it turns out, a movie which was a cultural hot topic, I think almost exactly a year ago. Don't Look Up, which was debated to death, but will be resurrected for the purposes of a forthcoming podcast, finished on 45.95%.
It's pretty close.
It was pretty close in the end.
People in the audience, if you don't like that outcome, just think it could have been different if only you had voted. But Vox Populi, Vox Dei is what I have been told is the order of the day, and we will be complying with the voice of the people.
So I can reveal that for the final episode of the year, Frankie, Tennant and I will be talking about Don't Look Up. So I am here to reveal I have not seen this movie.
Me either. No, me either.
I read a lot of things about it, and it actually didn't inspire me to want to sit down and watch it.
Same here. I was like, I don't. Yeah, no.
So
Just basically my thought process. No.
Yeah.
Other things to watch.
Yep.
All right, I'm up for it.
So that'll be fun. We'll pick it apart. Tenet, no spoilers.
At least it wasn't Naked Gun 2.5.
All right. Well, that is our show for today. We're all on Twitter, which, as far as I can tell, is still a website which exists. For how much longer we shall see. Frankie is at
Frankie Muscovich.
Tenet is at
Tenet Reed.
And my handle is at Luke Menzel. If you've got reports that you want us to review in 2023, you can send them to mailbag@letmesumup.net. You can, of course, subscribe to Let Me Sum Up in your favourite podcast app. And if you're looking to delve into the full back catalogue of episodes over the summer break, you'll find them all at letmesumup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich and Tenet Reed, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
I think we have done well not to dissolve into some kind of frenzy of electoral recriminations at the end. People have decided they didn't hear enough about Don't Look Up, so they're going to hear some more.
Maybe people have watched it or read a bunch of stuff about it and are interested to see what we say about it as well, just because it has been such a topic.
High pressure to be original and insightful on well-tilled soil.
I'm sure we can deliver, team. Spicy Vindaloo takes.